Hello, and welcome to APUSH. Today, we're going to be talking about the aftermath of the War for Independence and the continuing American Revolution. So, let's get started. So here's the basic objectives for today. Take a moment and see if you can take them in. And then we'll dive into our story and talk a little bit about the Articles of Confederation. So, the Peace of Paris was an incredibly complicated document because it's a multi-party international negotiation between four different groups. In the end, we didn't talk about the Spanish, but the Spanish jumped in and they wanted stuff. The French had their own interests, the British had their own interests, and we had our own interests. In the end, our negotiators, Ben Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, were able to negotiate a separate peace treaty with England apart from France, which was, of course, not what they were supposed to be doing, but it's what happened. And so we had these terms. The United States independence was acknowledged. That wasn't part of the treaty. That was the beginning place for negotiations. We got all land east of the Mississippi, and we got fishing rights in Newfoundland. The British would withdraw their forts their troops from the forts in the Ohio River Valley, and we would pay all of our debts to British citizens. So here's the basic maps. Take a moment, pause, take it in. It's pretty straightforward. And we'll be talking more about this moving ahead. The government that we created during the war was the Articles of Confederation. Single unicameral legislature, no executive, no judiciary. You have a president or a presiding officer chosen for the Articles Congress, who is not an executive. And so the powers that they had: declare war, raise armies, sign treaties, but they could not tax or regulate trade. So this is going to become a significant problem as we move forward. Mainly because the United States at this point had to finance a significant amount of the war through debt. We also printed our own paper currency, which again is going to be problematic because the value of a paper currency is tied to the faith that the government can generate revenue and that people will accept it. And if the financial footing of the country is not good, the value of the paper currency, not super great. So our paper currency quickly became worthless, and we had no way to pay foreign debts. Robert Morris, the financier of Liberty, our great sort of early financial wizard, somehow managed to come up with enough money for interest, but because we had no income, there was really no way we could pay down the principal. We couldn't take out future loans, which really limited the power of the government to do much of anything. Especially pay troops. Famously, the troops quartered in Newburgh, New York, were planning to mutiny, were planning to pull a new model army, march on Philadelphia, and force the Articles Congress to pass some sort of revenue-generating law in order to pay them. Washington got wind of this, famously showed up in a meeting where they didn't expect him to show up, walked in, pulled out his glasses and said something like, "Forgive me, my friends, for I've gone not only gray, but nearly blind in service of my country." And then he read this impassioned speech saying, quote, "As you value your own sacred honor, as you respect the rights of humanity, and as you regard the military and national character of America, to express your utter horror and detestation of the man who wishes, under any reason, to overturn the liberties of our country, who wickedly attempts to open the floodgates of civil discord, and to deluge our rising empire in blood." And so, Washington refuses to play the part of an American Cromwell and decides to go back home to Virginia, prompting the King of England to say something like, "That's the greatest man who's ever lived." We're also having to deal with the Western question. One, what to do with all this territory in the Northwest, and two, what to deal with the Native Americans who live there. This is Joseph Brandt. You might remember from previous episodes that he was one of the Native American chiefs who fought with the British against the Americans. In the aftermath of this, you still have lots of anti-American Native American groups on the frontier who really have no interest in ceding their land to the Americans, and the United States at this point doesn't have the money or military strength to push campaigns against them. So that is a question that still has to be settled. The Native Americans, again, start trying to unite together in order to push back against American settlement. Quote, Brethren of the United States of America, it is now more than 3 years since peace was made between the King of Great Britain and you, but we, the Indians, were disappointed, finding ourselves not included in that peace. For we thought that its conclusion would have promoted a friendship between the United States and the Indians. You kindled your council forest where you thought proper, without consulting us, and which you held separate treaties, and have entirely neglected out of plan of having a general conference with the different nations of the Confederacy. So, par for the course for Europeans. They negotiate peace between themselves and totally ignore the Native Americans, who are the ones who are actively controlling this land. So, not surprising at all. We see significant pushback against Western settlement, and in the end, we try to sign treaties with Native Americans to cede land, and sometimes we're able to, but for the most part, Native Americans would reject the validities of these treaties. So the Treaty of Fort Mcintosh ceded significant Native American land to Western settlers. It was signed by only a couple Native American chiefs, and the rest of the Confederation said no. And they started basically saying, we're not going to recognize any of these treaties unless you deal with us all as a united group, which of course the Americans didn't want to do because that would give the Native Americans significantly more bargaining power. Congress passes something called the Northwest Ordinance, basically totally ignoring Native American land claims. This voids all former colonial land claims and makes sure that the states that previously claimed this land are not going to claim it. It subdivides the Northwest Ordinance into a series of different territories, sets aside land for public education. It bans slavery in these territories and makes sure that the civil rights are going to be protected there. And probably most importantly, it establishes the principle by which new territories are going to become states. This seems obvious to us, but it was not necessarily a foregone conclusion in the early days of our country that we'd have more than 13 states. There was already the tacit agreement, of course, to create Vermont, which we talked about in our simulation. But we could have just had 13 superstates expanding westward, with each state claiming new territory and administering it as we move west. Instead, we decided that when a few Americans arrive in this territory, it'll be organized into a territory with a governor appointed by Congress. When they get to 5,000 free men, they elect a bicameral legislature. And when they reach 60,000 men, they can write a state constitution and then submit it in order to potentially become a new state. And so we decided that we're going to add new states, and the process to add new states has stayed pretty consistent since 1787. We also start developing our own unique American society. Thomas Jefferson and others adopt this sort of neoclassical architectural style. George Washington becomes an American folk hero, both because of his just amazing awesomeness through the American Revolution, but also we start to get tall tales about Washington as he becomes sort of a guide for moral behavior. Most famously is the story of the cherry tree, where it was claimed that Washington, when he was a child, chopped down a cherry tree with his hatchet, and then when his father asked him about it, he said, "I cannot tell a lie," and admitted to the whole thing. This story is completely apocryphal, was made up by an early Washington biographer named Mason Weems in order to sell books right after Washington's death. And so we quickly get this type of almost civic religion built around Washington and the Founding Fathers, which to some extent continues to this day. I've had students in class come in telling me that they were told the cherry tree story as if it were true, when in reality it's a morality tale created by early Americans in order to sort of reinforce proper behavior. Here's the story of the cherry tree. You can take a moment and read it if you're not familiar with it, but just know, totally apocryphal, completely made up in order to teach proper behavior. We also get the freedom of religion. This is a statute drafted by Thomas Jefferson, and it's going to eliminate all state-sponsored churches. So federal tax money should not be given to religious institutions, and freedom of religious worship is going to become one of the hallmarks of early American society, even before the Bill of Rights is passed. As far as social class goes, we've been dealing with this problem of increasing wealth and social stratification. We do start to redistrict and pay more attention to the backcountry areas. And now that we have significantly more land, if we can ever effectively displace/deal with the Native American problems, it's going to open up new opportunities. And so this creates a leveling of society, although most colonies at this point still had property requirements for voting. The role of women is going to be profoundly changed by the American Revolution. Abigail Adams famously writes to her husband John Adams to remember the ladies. Molly Pitcher famously helps work artillery during the American Revolution. Women helped gather supplies, play important parts in committees of correspondence, took on pseudo-governmental roles where the men were off fighting. This is going to be one of the trends, by the way, that we're going to see throughout American, and honestly, throughout history in general, that in times of civil strife, women's roles in society greatly increase. Women also get more rights in most states over divorce, over the owning of property, and we get a movement forward. Plus, Republican motherhood becomes even more ingrained as our democratic institutions become more standardized and formalized. So as popular political participation grows, the role of women in preparing men for that political participation and women for having children who might be men that could be prepared for political participation is also going to increase. Judith Sargent Murray is one of the most famous early advocates for women's rights, and she's brilliant. And so if you're not familiar with her work, you should definitely take some time and read her because she is, again, brilliant, eloquent, and overall fantastic. We also see all of these changes, so take a moment and pause to read this. I sort of already went over it, but Republican motherhood is in some way an expansion of women's rights and in some ways fits clearly into the idea of the cult of domesticity, which we're going to talk about much more as we get into the market revolution. Northern states also begin to free their slaves in the year after the American Revolution. We get this, quote, first emancipation, as slavery is banned in most of the northern states, as well as the Northwest Territory. Southerners also start freeing their slaves. Washington famously does not free his slaves, but his wife does free his slaves after his death. But even with this happening, we still get racist ideas about social Darwinism and race and class, which are going to continue in American society and influence American policies and opinions for pretty much the rest of American history. We also get fugitive slave clauses passed both in the Constitution and across the country, which significantly limit the rights of both escaped enslaved people and also free people of color. And we start prosecuting and persecuting loyalists, taking their property, and driving them out of society. So, loyalists are generally pushed out, their property is not respected, and they generally have to flee to either Canada or England. So, that brings us to the end of our story for today. Tomorrow we'll talk more about the Articles of Confederation and its failures, and the movement towards this Constitution. Thank you for listening.